Hi everyone, today I'm going to be showing you a few ways of presenting your SketchUp model. So any of you who are familiar with SketchUp, this is the 3D workspace and it consists of the ground, the sky and our axes here. Now many of you may decide just to take a screenshot of your model and then drag and drop that into your presentations. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but there's a few things that we can do just to slightly improve our presentation. Now, we're not going to be going into rendering, that's a whole different ball game. This is just if you want to present your actual digital model as shown in the 3D workspace, as many of us have trouble rendering purely because of the specifications of the systems we're using, or simply because of the time it can sometimes take. So, one of the first things we can do in SketchUp, just to add a little more interest, is go up to View in the top left, and we can turn on Shadows. And what this does is it introduces a light source. It's not a particularly realistic light source. The shadows are very, very sharp, no matter what changes you make to the lighting. However, it does add a bit of interest and show off your details and sculpting. We can actually change the date and the time of the shadows by going into the default tray on the right hand side here. Now if you don't have the default tray already open, just go up to Window and Default Tray here if you're in Windows. If you're on a Mac, all the list of all these different windows will appear here. We can see that there's a Shadows tab. If we click on that, it drops down and we can see we've got two sliders with the time and the date. And as we change those, so changes the lighting. So that's one really nice way of just adding a bit more interest. Another way is to change our camera. Obviously we can rotate and it's quite a pivotal thing for modelling in the first place. However, there's a few changes we can make to the overall camera. If we got to the top of the screen and click on camera, you can see that we've got three options here: parallel projection, perspective and 2-point perspective. And changing those will change how our model physically appears in the workspace, and it becomes much more apparent when you click on parallel projection. You get this kind of isometric view here. This is simultaneously really good for technical drawing, because if we go to camera and then standard views, you can see we've got a selection of standardized viewpoints. And we can click on front, and when it's combined with parallel projection, we basically get a coloured in technical drawing, for want of a better phrase. So that's one thing we can change as well. Do be aware that when you've got shadows activated, it can slow down your system a lot, especially if you've got a high polygon count in your model. So only use that for your final image. Any other time, turn it off. Now what we can do is we can play around with the actual style of our scene. So where we've got the grey floor here and we've got the faded sky there, that's actually a style. And the colour and the texture and the image of these can change, as can our overall model. So if we open the Styles tab on the right hand side, you see we get all these little windows pop up with the same 3D shape, but it looks different in each one. As we click through those, you can see the actual visual of our model changes. So a nice one that I was just on there is we have all the colours of our textures, but the texture itself has disappeared, so it gives this kind of very nice graphic look. We've also got an Xray mode, which allows us to see all of the geometry that we have going on, so we can actually see through the model. And we've got a very similar wireframe style. And these may or may not be useful depending on what you're doing. This style, for example, we could export into Photoshop and then use for concept art, because we have all our lighting values here, but now we can go and kind of paint over it and add our own textures. Now, these are just a few presets, and where it says default styles at the top here, if you click on that menu, you'll see we get a few other categories, and a really lovely one to play around with. If you go to sketchy edges, you'll see that it really changes up the style. First of all, our background's completely gone. Second of all, we get this lovely sketchy look to it, as though we have physically drawn it. And we can go through all of these and just play around. Now, in this instance, you may not actually want shadows activated, because if we turn those off, we get a pure sketch, and this is really great for concept art, because we just drag and drop this into Photoshop or Illustrator and job done. One thing to be aware of is that many students don't like the overall look of this because it is a bit too rough around the edges. Just be aware that when you export a graphic of this, it will be a lot more refined than what we've got going on here. This is kind of exaggerated. If I go back to my default style, what we can do is at the top here where we've got these three little tabs, there's one called Edit. And if we click on that, you'll see that we can actually change the individual elements of our 3D style. So I can actually change the colour and the texture of the ground and the sky, or I can actually just turn them off and apply an overall background. So currently our background is set to grey, and I can change that to white. If I then turn off the axes, which I can do by going up to View and turning off axes there, I've got just my 3D model in a blank space. Now this is ideal for presentations because we can just drag and drop that in, and there's no border or frame, so it looks really nice and integrated into our presentation. If you've got a texture or a colour to your presentation, then it's just a very quick Photoshop job. At any time we can just toggle those on and off, and we've got a few other settings through here. So for example, we can turn off edges and profiles so that we have a 3D model that's purely texture and form. We've got none of those harsh borders going on there. Now, depending on which one of these methods you go for, whether you change the camera, the style, the shadows, the textures, maybe you change all of them, how do we export that? Again, we don't need to take a screenshot. All we need to do is go to File, Export 2D Graphic, and that will export a PNG or a JPEG depending on what settings you want to use there. It won't export all of the toolbars here. So actually that's a much better way of going about it because you don't have to do any editing afterwards. We can also export animations. So if you have a presentation and you're going to fill it with 20, 30 images of your finished model, then arguably a video, a short animation may be a better way to go about it. How do we go about doing that? We need to create scenes. And this is effectively taking photos with our camera positioned in different places, and SketchUp animates between them. So if I go into my Scenes tab on the right hand side here, I'm just going to click Add, this little plus sign here. And you'll normally get a warning box saying that you're updating the scene and you've not saved changes to your style or what have you. Normally, it's fine to just click Save as New Style and create a scene. There's nothing too much that can really go wrong there. You'll see we get a little thumbnail and scene 1. Now I'm going to move the camera. And it doesn't matter what you do, if you zoom out or you rotate your model, what have you. I'm now going to click plus, and we get a new scene. I'm just going to add a third, move the camera again, and add a fourth. What you'll also see is that up at the top left, our scenes appear here as well. And when we click on each one, SketchUp animates in between. Now this is really useful because we basically have an animation of our 3D model. We can show it all. We don't have to take photos in between every single element, zoom in and take details and overall shots. we can just create an animation like this. If we go to View and down to Animation, we've got Settings. And we can change how long it takes to transition between each scene. And we can also choose how long the animation stays on each image before it moves to the next. So for example, if I up the scene delay to 3 seconds and the scene transition to 6, if I go to View, Animation and click on Play, we should now have a bit of a pause and then a much slower transition between that said scene. And obviously you will change that time dependent upon how this is going to work in your presentation or on your website or whatever format you're going to use to show this. Just going to click on Stop there. All we need to do is get a copy of this. Again, we're not doing a screen record. We just go to File, Export, Animation, and then you can see here, Save as Type. We can click on that and save it as whatever we want. An MP4 works in pretty much all cases. So there's just a few really quick, simple ways of presenting your SketchUp model in a way other than just taking a screenshot.